On their 10th wedding anniversary, Anna slipped back into her white gown, its hem brushing against the wheels of her chair. She believed this photo shoot on the mountain would capture love that endured even through her accident. But as her husband Victor gripped the handles of her wheelchair, his smile was carved from ice. At the cliff's edge, his hands did not steady her. They let go. In that breathless second between life and death, a German shepherd erupted from the pines, slamming into the chair and snatching her back from the abyss. This is a story of vows broken, of betrayal unveiled, and of a dog who carried heaven's miracle on 4 legs. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. Black Ridge, a mountain town cradled in the rugged spine of Colorado, woke beneath a sky of heavy iron clouds. The streets were narrow ribbons of asphalt that gleamed faintly under a glaze of frost, and the roofs of small shops leaned into each other like old men sharing secrets. The weather was merciless for early November, the air sharp and dry as cut glass, the kind that burned the lungs when inhaled too quickly. Pine needles rattled like brittle bones in the gusts that swept down from the slopes, and the sun was only a pale coin trapped behind curtains of gray. In the town square, the bronze statue of a miner stood dusted with white, as though winter had reached down early to claim him. Few people lingered outdoors, even the stray dogs curled into doorways, noses buried under tails. Against this stark backdrop, a small house with cedar siding and windows that glowed softly from within seemed almost like a lantern resisting the gloom. Inside, Anna Hughes sat before an oval mirror, her wheelchair angled carefully so that the dress spread around her like a pool of quiet light. At 32, Anna bore the kind of beauty that is not loud but steady, carved not from perfection, but resilience. She was tall, her figure softened by the years, yet still slender in the way of someone whose body had once been trained by dance. Her accident 3 years earlier had stolen the use of her legs, but it had not taken her grace. Her hair, a cascade of chestnut waves, had been brushed until it shone with hints of copper where the lamplight touched it. She pinned some of it back with delicate pearl combs, leaving the rest to fall against her shoulders. Her skin held a pale ivory glow, almost translucent under the winter light, and her lips curved in that quiet way of women who smile more with memory than with impulse. What drew people in, however, were her eyes, a grayish blue, like mountain lakes under thin ice, eyes that revealed both gratitude for the life she still had and an unspoken ache for the distance that had grown between her and the man she married. The dress she wore was the very gown she had chosen a decade ago, though altered to drape beautifully from her seated posture. The satin was no longer the sharp white of untouched snow, but had mellowed into the soft cream of pressed parchment. Lace sleeves, hand-sewn with tiny threads of silver, clung delicately to her arms, and the hem pooled over her lap, spreading across the wheelchair like a wave caught in mid-motion. The gown had once symbolized beginnings. Today, she hoped it might become a symbol of endurance. Victor Hughes, her husband, moved down the hall with heavy, deliberate steps. At 38, Victor was a man who carried handsomeness like a scar. It was there, undeniable, but shaped by the battles of his life. He stood of medium height, his frame compact yet sinewy, forged by years of physical labor as a carpenter before he shifted into small contracting jobs. His face was angular, a square jaw framed by a beard, trimmed short, but never quite precise, as if control had begun to slip from his hands. His hair, thick and dark, bore streaks of silver at the temples, a reminder of debts and disappointments that had aged him faster than time alone. His eyes were a deep brown, but they carried shadows of frustration, of long nights calculating bills, of feeling the slow erosion of dreams he once dared to claim. Neighbors knew him as reserved, the kind of man who fixed a fence without being asked, yet rarely lingered to share a drink afterward. He had earned their respect, but not their warmth. Since Anna's accident, a hardness had nested in him. He smiled still, but it was a smile rehearsed, one that stopped before it reached the eyes. Victor wore the same suit he had donned on their wedding day, though the shoulders now fit snugger, widened by a decade of hard work at the gym as much as on the job. The charcoal fabric carried a faint shine from repeated dry cleanings, and his tie was a deep navy, freshly knotted. He adjusted his cufflinks with meticulous care, as though the act of grooming could disguise the restlessness gnawing inside him. Standing in the doorway, he studied Anna for a long moment. The sight of her in that dress should have softened him, and perhaps a part of him wanted it to. But another part felt only the weight of what had been lost. Her accident had not only taken her legs, but it had also shackled his dreams to responsibilities he had never chosen. "You look," he began, then faltered. Words had once come easily, but now they landed heavy on his tongue. "You look like the day itself is bowing to you." Anna turned, a faint laugh rising, the laugh she used when she feared silence more than she feared words. "That's the line you used 10 years ago," she said. "Maybe if you say it again on the mountain, it will mean even more." She wanted to believe this outing, this idea of dressing once more in the clothes of their beginning, could renew what felt fragile. She wanted to imagine that by returning to where their vows began, they might stitch over the invisible gap that had grown between them. The idea had been Victor's, tossed casually into conversation 2 months ago while unloading groceries. What if, for our 10th anniversary, we wore our wedding clothes again and went up Black Ridge for photos, the kind we can frame and remember? Anna had seized on it, her heart lifting like a kite in sudden wind. She had called the photographer herself the very next day. Now, as Victor wheeled her chair toward the door, the photographer arrived, pulling into the driveway with a practical sedan dusted with salt from the mountain roads. Her name was Mia Delgado, 27 years old, petite and quick, with black hair cut in a sharp bob and a spark of wit in her brown eyes. She wore a quilted jacket in olive green, jeans tucked into boots scuffed from years of use, and carried a large camera bag, slung across one shoulder. Mia had grown up in a nearby town, the daughter of a librarian and a mechanic, and had earned a reputation as the photographer who could coax truth out of stiff smiles. She greeted them with warm, calloused hands, her voice carrying an easy melody. "Happy 10 years, Mr. and Mrs. Hughes," she said, her grin wide and sincere. "We'll make sure these pictures show not just who you are, but what you've been through." When she noticed Anna's dress, her expression softened. "It fits you as though it waited just for today," she said quietly, almost reverently, before checking the light with her practiced eye. Victor shook her hand firmly, complimenting her punctuality. He respected punctuality the way other men respected power. "We'll need help lifting the chair into the truck," he remarked, and Mia moved without hesitation, steadying the wheels and fastening straps with practiced care. She had assisted in documenting veterans' homecomings, school events, even a few births. She knew how to stand in tension and still keep her focus. With everything secured, they set off. Anna was lifted carefully into the passenger seat by Victor, his arms firm beneath her, and she let herself relax into the ritual, remembering how he had carried her once before. 10 years ago, across a threshold. The truck rumbled down Maple Street, past the church where they had spoken their vows. The steeple, tipped with ice, pointed into a gray sky, and for a fleeting moment Anna thought she heard echoes of the organ, smelled the faint sweetness of lilies. Her hands clutched the folds of her dress, and she whispered a prayer no one heard. The town fell behind them, and the mountains rose ahead. Vast, solemn, eternal. The truck's tires crunched against gravel as they turned onto County Road 12, the path that wound upward toward the overlook. The forest pressed close, the pines leaning like a congregation. Anna looked out at the wilderness, her eyes catching light in the spaces between trees. For a heartbeat, she felt hope, thin but present, like a bird warming in cold hands. Perhaps this day would be what she needed. Proof that love could still be carried forward, even on wheels. Victor drove silently, his jaw clenched, his thoughts known only to himself. The truck climbed steadily, tires crunching over the winding gravel road that coiled around Black Ridge like a serpent, the forest pressing in close on either side. The air thinned as they rose, and the pine trees thickened, their tall spines scraping at a sky dark with gathering weather. Inside the cab, the heater hummed against the cold, filling the silence with a steady rhythm that felt more like a barrier than a comfort. Victor sat behind the wheel, his shoulders squared in the charcoal suit, his jaw tight, the muscle ticking just above his stubble-lined cheek. His eyes, once so easily warmed when they fell upon Anna, now carried an unreadable darkness, the kind of look a man wears when he has already decided something but refuses to voice it aloud. The years had pressed on him, like weights hung one by one, until his spine bent in ways invisible to others, but clear to him. Business failures, loans that turned into shackles, debts whispered about by men in bars with folded arms and eyes that did not blink. These things had carved their marks across his soul, and the idea of love had become less a sanctuary and more a tether. His hands gripped the steering wheel with such force the veins stood out across his knuckles, not from fear of the road, but from the battle raging within. Beside him, Anna adjusted the folds of her dress over her lap, her fingers smoothing the satin as though by perfecting the fabric she might mend the unseen tear between them. Her face glowed faintly in the muted light, her eyes carrying a hopeful brightness that had survived so many disappointments. She still believed in small miracles. Her heart clung to the notion that this day, this photograph, could repair the fractures that years had carved between them. Though her body remained confined to the chair, her spirit reached outward, seeking the Victor she once knew, the man who had laughed with her on summer nights and held her hand with reverence instead of restraint. She tilted her face toward him, searching for some glimmer in his profile, but he kept his gaze locked on the ribbon of road ahead. In the back seat, Mia Delgado busied herself with checking her cameras, adjusting settings with quick, precise motions, unaware of the storm quietly brewing in the front. She hummed softly to herself, an instinctive tune that filled the silence, though she glanced up occasionally and noted the tension. Mia had learned to read faces through her lens, and she saw in Victor's the rigid lines of a man unraveling. She said nothing, her instinct telling her to let silence reveal itself rather than prod it with words. As the truck rounded a bend, the forest gave way to an open view of the valley below, a vast sweep of land dotted with farms and crossed by the silver thread of a river. Anna gasped softly, lifting a hand to the window. "It's beautiful," she whispered, her voice touched with awe. Her smile was gentle, almost childlike, and in that moment she radiated the same innocence she had on their wedding day. Victor glanced at her, and for a fleeting instant the hardness in his eyes wavered. He remembered the girl she had been, full of laughter, dancing barefoot in the grass, the promise of a life that seemed unbreakable. But the memory clashed with the reality of bills waiting on the counter, of phone calls avoided, of collectors who did not care for vows or anniversaries. The moment passed, and his face closed again, the lines of strain carving deeper. They stopped briefly at a turnout to stretch and check the straps securing the wheelchair. Victor moved around the truck with mechanical precision, his tall frame cutting against the gray horizon. He had the bearing of a man who commanded respect, but there was no tenderness in his movements, only efficiency. Mia offered to help, but he waved her back with a short shake of his head, his lips pressed into a thin line. Anna watched him from her seat, her fingers tightening on the blanket across her lap. She wanted to reach him, to remind him that they had survived storms before, that love was not a ledger of debts and credits, but a faith that endured. Yet the words caught in her throat, strangled by the fear that perhaps he no longer wished to be reached. A cold gust swept through, lifting strands of her chestnut hair and chilling her skin. She pulled the blanket tighter and whispered, almost to herself, "Today will be different." Victor's eyes flickered toward her, but he said nothing, closing the tailgate with a muted thud that sounded too final, too sharp against the wind. They continued upward, the road narrowing, the forest thick again. Victor's mind churned beneath his stillness. He thought of the creditors who had cornered him outside the lumber yard, their voices low, their words edged with steel. He thought of the promises he had made Anna years ago, promises that now felt like stones tied to his feet. He thought of freedom, not the freedom of love, but of release, of starting again without the burden of a life that felt heavier with each passing day. His gaze shifted briefly to Anna's reflection in the glass, the soft curve of her profile, the veil of hope in her eyes. She deserved better, he told himself, though even in his mind the words rang hollow. He gripped the wheel tighter, the decision forming like frost on glass, slow, silent, inevitable. Anna, oblivious to the storm behind his eyes, turned her attention outward, marveling at the shifting light on the ridges. She leaned slightly forward, her voice brightening. "Do you remember, Victor, the first time we came here? The light was golden, and the air smelled of pine sap. You said it felt like the world was pausing to watch us." Her words reached for him like a hand stretched across a widening gulf. Victor forced a smile, the corners of his mouth pulling against the weight in his chest. "I remember," he said, though his tone was flat, drained of the wonder she recalled. Anna's heart ached at the emptiness in his reply, but she pressed on, determined not to let the silence win. "That's why I wanted today to matter," she whispered, "so we can remember who we were." The truck wound higher, and the sky darkened, the clouds gathering with the promise of snow. The mountain loomed above them, silent and immense, a witness to both vows and betrayals. In the cab, 3 people rode together, but only one carried hope, and only one carried the secret of what he intended to do before the day was over. The truck's engine sighed to silence as Victor pulled it into the gravel clearing near the mountain's edge, the world suddenly opening before them in a sweep of air and distance. The overlook stretched like a stone balcony above the valley, and the wind roared here with a voice older than memory, carrying the scent of pine resin and cold stone. Below, the forest canopy rippled in shades of evergreen and shadow, and above, the clouds shifted restlessly, revealing occasional slivers of silver light that fell across the mountains like the brush strokes of a distracted painter. Victor stepped out first, his tall figure cut against the pale horizon, suit jacket whipping in the gusts, his tie snapping like a flag at war. His face was drawn into sharp lines, the kind of face that would have been considered striking if not for the tension that pulled at his mouth and the weary calculation in his eyes. He moved with mechanical certainty, opening the tailgate and lowering Anna's chair with practiced efficiency. There was no gentleness, but no clumsiness either. His movements were precise, each gesture the echo of a man who had done this many times before, but whose heart was no longer in the labor. Mia followed behind, her short frame leaning forward against the wind as she clutched her camera bag close. Her bobbed black hair whipped around her cheeks, her earrings flashing whenever the clouds allowed a hint of sun. She scanned the overlook with the instinct of a professional, her brown eyes narrowing as she calculated where the light would fall and how the wind would play with the folds of fabric. She crouched once to feel the texture of the stone under her boots, nodding as though confirming something only she understood. Anna was lifted from the passenger seat by Victor, her body light in his arms, though the act carried a heaviness that pressed against both of them. He set her gently into the wheelchair, adjusting the blanket over her lap before stepping back. The gown spilled around her like a small snowfall, the lace catching on the uneven ground, the hem darkened where it kissed the damp stone. Anna raised a hand to brush away strands of hair the wind had torn loose, her face flushed from the cold and from the emotion swelling in her chest. She looked out at the endless valley, then back down at her lap, at the white fabric that had once meant beginnings. "I feel," she murmured, her voice barely rising above the wind, "like I am that girl again, the one who thought love could conquer anything." Her smile trembled but held, and the light in her eyes fought against the storm around them. "I'm happy to wear this dress again, Victor." Victor stood just behind her, his shadow falling across the back of her chair, his hands resting on the cool metal handles as though he were steadying himself as much as the chair. His lips curled upward, but it was not a smile. It was a thin, cutting thing. A line drawn not from joy but from some darker place. He leaned closer, his words low, carried almost entirely to her ears alone. "Then let it be the last time you ever do." The words struck her like a sudden drop in the road, her breath catching in her throat as she turned her head slightly, searching his face for some hint of jest. But his eyes did not carry humor. They were flat, cold, a dull brown hardened by years of resentment, debts, and decisions made in silence. For a heartbeat the world seemed to tilt, the wind louder, the ground less certain beneath her wheels. Mia, standing a few paces away, raised her camera, oblivious to the poison laced within Victor's words. She was too busy focusing on how the veil lifted like smoke in the gusts, how the dress spread across the ground in a way that would photograph as timeless. "Just angle the chair a little more toward me," Mia called over the roar of the wind, her tone bright, unaware of the shadows threading into the moment. Anna's hands tightened on the blanket in her lap, her knuckles pale, her eyes wide with the first flicker of fear. She looked down at the cliff edge only feet away, where the brittle grass and loose gravel surrendered to empty air, and her chest tightened as she realized how little separated her from the abyss. She whispered, almost pleading, "Victor." But Victor only pressed his hands more firmly on the chair handles, his jaw set, his mouth closed into that merciless line, his presence looming over her as the wind tugged at both of them. The wind rose in a sharp cry across the cliff, tearing at Victor's suit jacket and tugging at Anna's veil like a warning finger. He stood behind her chair, his palms steady on the metal handles, his breath drawn long and slow, as though he were measuring not just the distance to the edge, but the distance between who he had once been and what he was about to do. His face was carved into grim lines, jaw clenched, a faint stubble outlining the hard edges of his cheeks. There was no hesitation in his eyes now, only the cold resolve of a man who had decided that love had become a prison. The overlook stretched silent, but for the roar of wind and the clicking adjustments of Mia Delgado's camera. Mia crouched several feet away, focused on finding the perfect angle. Her small frame leaned against the gusts, her black bob snapping against her jawline as she lifted the lens to her face. Through her viewfinder, she saw Anna's veil flutter upward, the lace shimmering against the gray sky like smoke catching the light, and she murmured to herself about the beauty of the moment, completely unaware of the venom coiling in Victor's chest. Anna sat unaware too, her hands resting lightly in her lap, the satin folds of her gown gathered neatly around the chair. Her chestnut hair whipped free of its combs, strands stinging her cheeks. But she smiled despite the sting, her gray-blue eyes soft with gratitude. She thought this moment would be frozen forever in photographs that proved love had endured 10 years and every storm between. Her lips parted, and she whispered into the wind, "I'm happy, Victor. Happy to wear this dress again." But Victor's answer was not a reassurance, not the warmth she longed for. His mouth twisted into a smirk, sharp and cold. "Then let it be the last time," he muttered, and before her heart could catch the meaning, his fingers flicked the brake levers free. The chair rolled forward. Gravel shifted beneath the wheels, small stones scattering like startled birds. Anna's gasp tore from her throat, raw and terrified, as the world lurched toward the abyss. The hem of her gown lifted, flapping wildly like wings caught in a storm, a broken angel hovering over the edge. She cried out, her voice swallowed by the roar of wind and distance, her arms clutching the sides of the chair, though she knew nothing could hold her back. Mia dropped her camera, the strap jerking hard against her neck as it swung, her eyes widening with disbelief. She froze for a second too long, the reality of betrayal too monstrous to process. And then, from the line of pines just beyond the clearing, the silence was shattered by a sound as primal as it was fierce, a bark deep and resonant, splitting the mountain air. Out of the shadows burst a German shepherd, his body a streak of gold and black, muscles taut beneath his thick coat. He was 7 years old, his frame powerful, though one hind leg carried the faintest limp from an injury long healed but never forgotten. His name was Rex. His eyes, a brilliant amber, burned with an intensity that seemed more than animal, a loyalty forged in the fire of instincts and devotion. His ears stood erect, the scar above his left brow a mark of battles survived, and his jaws parted in a snarl that carried both fury and determination. Rex hurtled forward, claws scrabbling against the stone, the air alive with his momentum. Anna's scream cracked against the sky, but before the chair could tip fully into the void, Rex slammed into its side with the full force of his weight. The impact jolted the chair sideways, sending it careening toward a cluster of exposed roots that jutted from the rocky soil just feet from the drop. The wheels caught, wedging tight, halting the deadly roll at the final second. The gown whipped violently, the veil snapped, but Anna's body remained on solid ground. She clutched the arms of the chair, trembling so violently her teeth chattered, though no cold could account for it. Victor staggered back 2 steps, his face blanching with shock. He had not anticipated interruption, certainly not the intervention of a dog that appeared like a spirit from the forest. For the first time in years, a flicker of fear danced behind his eyes, though it was quickly smothered by anger. "Damn mutt!" he hissed, but the words sounded thin against the pounding of his heart. Rex planted himself between the wheelchair and the man, hackles raised high along his spine, teeth bared in a grim display of defiance. His growl vibrated through the earth itself, a sound pulled from ancient places where wolves still remembered what it meant to protect the helpless. His amber eyes locked on Victor's, and in them was no doubt, no hesitation, only the unshakable vow of a guardian. Mia finally broke free of her paralysis, scrambling toward Anna, her camera swinging uselessly at her side. Her cheeks had flushed crimson from the cold and from outrage, her lips parting as though to demand answers, though no words yet formed. She knelt by the chair, gripping Anna's hand with surprising strength, her own brown eyes wide and wet with horror. Anna's chest heaved, her breath ragged, her heart hammering against the bodice of her gown. She turned her gaze toward Rex, who stood unmoving, every muscle strung tight, his body a shield against the husband she had once trusted. Tears blurred her vision, but through the haze she whispered, "You saved me." Rex's ears flicked back at the sound of her voice, and he whined softly without breaking his stance, as if to reassure her that he had no intention of moving until the danger was gone. The wind whipped harder, rattling the branches of the pines, but in that clearing the loudest sound was the growl of a dog who had rewritten the end of a story in the span of a heartbeat. The clearing seemed to hold its breath in the seconds after the wheelchair stopped. The sound of gravel still rolling over the cliff's edge faded into silence, and only the wind dared to move, tugging Anna's veil like a ghost, desperate to carry her away. Anna clutched the armrests, her knuckles bloodless, her chest heaving as sobs escaped in uneven bursts. Tears streaked her pale cheeks, clinging to the loose strands of chestnut hair whipped wild by the gusts. She had thought her life would end, and the terror of that realization shook her like a storm through fragile glass. Rex stood rigid in front of her, a wall of gold and black fur braced against the world. His body was taut, his chest heaving, a growl rolling deep in his throat, so steady and powerful that even the mountain air seemed to vibrate with it. His amber eyes locked on Victor, gleaming not only with instinct but with something uncanny, a furious devotion that seemed almost divine. The scar over his left brow deepened as his face tightened, and each flick of his tail was sharp, deliberate, a signal of warning. Victor staggered backward, disbelief etched across his sharp features. His lean frame trembled as though the ground beneath him had betrayed him, just as surely as the dog now had. His jaw clenched, and for a moment his eyes wavered, showing a man unmasked by fear, a man cornered not by creditors but by the very life he had sought to abandon. Rage took over, blotting out that fleeting weakness. "Damn dog!" he roared, his voice cracking against the wind, hands curling into fists at his sides. He looked less like a husband now and more like a man cornered by fate itself, every muscle ready to lash out. Mia Delgado's scream cut through the standoff. She stumbled backward, her camera banging against her hip, her face pale as snow, her short black hair plastered against her cheeks, and her wide brown eyes darted between Anna and Victor. Her voice trembled but did not break as she yanked her phone from her jacket pocket. "I'm calling the police!" she shouted, her fingers shaking as they pressed against the screen. She was young, but not naive. Her spirit sharpened by the countless moments she had seen through a lens, moments when truth broke through facade. And what she had just witnessed was truth enough to strip away all illusions. Anna sobbed harder, her voice catching on every breath. She leaned forward in her chair, reaching a trembling hand toward Rex, who stood immovable, a sentinel. "Please, stay," she whispered, though she knew without doubt he would not leave her. The dog's growl deepened, his lips curling back to reveal sharp teeth, white against the dark cavern of his mouth. Victor's eyes darted from Rex to Anna, then to Mia, fumbling with her phone. He felt the net tightening, the betrayal of a dog, the accusation in his wife's tear-filled eyes, the certainty of another witness dialing law into existence. For a brief moment, his cold hazel eyes softened, flickering with the weight of years, 10 years of marriage, 10 years of respectability, now unraveling in one horrifying instant. But the softness vanished as quickly as it had appeared. He bared his teeth in return, though his were human, weaker, no match for the beast before him. He stepped forward, a half lunge of desperation, but Rex's growl turned into a bark so thunderous it shook the loose stones underfoot. The sound was primal, protective, the kind of command that no human could ignore. Victor froze, his fists still raised but useless, caught in the blaze of amber eyes that did not waver. Mia's voice carried over the gusts as she shouted into her phone, her words rushed and desperate. Yes, yes, on Black Ridge near the cliff overlook. A woman. Her husband tried to. Please, hurry. There's a dog, a German shepherd. He saved her. Please send someone fast. Her words tumbled, but they were enough. She pressed the device close to her ear, nodding furiously, though no one could see her. Her cheeks flushed red, part from the cold, part from adrenaline, as she cast a furious glance at Victor. Anna, shivering in the chair, tightened her grip on the dog's thick fur when his body edged closer to her. His flank pressed against her gown, grounding her in the chaos. She whispered through sobs, "You're my angel," her lips trembling with every syllable. Victor shook his head violently, his voice breaking into the space between them. "You think that dog makes you safe? You think anyone will believe a mutt over me?" But even as he spoke, he knew the lie of it. The truth was etched too clearly in the scene before him, the wheelchair lodged in roots, the gown flaring like a broken wing, the raw terror on Anna's face, the camera Mia had dropped now lying in the dirt with its memory card filled with images that could not be denied, and above all the dog, Rex, glowing as if lit from within, his very presence undoing the darkness Victor had tried to cast. Rex did not move, did not blink. His amber eyes seemed to pierce through every layer of pretense, holding Victor frozen in the reality of what he had done. For the first time in years, Victor felt powerless, not against men in suits demanding payment, but against a creature whose only weapon was devotion so fierce it became divine. Mia's voice trembled again as she pressed the phone closer. "They're coming," she said aloud, almost as reassurance for Anna. "Just hold on. They'll be here soon." Anna wept harder at those words, the sound raw, like fabric tearing. She lifted her trembling hand again and pressed it against Rex's shoulder, her fingers curling into his thick fur. The dog shifted slightly, leaning into her touch without turning his gaze from Victor, as though to promise he would remain, immovable, until all danger was gone. The wind swelled, carrying away the last of the silence. Victor's curses fell flat against the mountain air. No longer powerful, no longer feared. He had lost control, undone not by another man, but by a four-legged hero whose very existence declared a different kind of justice. In the hollowed quiet of the mountain, the truth stood plain. Anna lived, and Victor's betrayal had been witnessed. The wail of sirens cut through the mountain air, distant at first, then rising in urgency as patrol vehicles wound their way up the narrow road toward the overlook. The sharp red and blue lights reflected off the granite walls, flashing like angry spirits in the fog. Anna clutched Rex tightly, her fingers still trembling as they dug into his thick fur. The German shepherd remained unmoving, his body pressed against her chair like a living barrier, amber eyes unflinching. Mia stood nearby, one hand gripping her phone, the other pressed hard to her lips, her breath coming in ragged bursts. When the first cruiser pulled into the clearing, its tires crunching over loose gravel, the officers emerged quickly, their boots heavy against the stone. The lead officer was Sheriff Tom Gray, a man in his mid-50s, tall and broad-shouldered with a frame built by decades of mountain work and law enforcement. His hair was silver at the temples, cropped short, and his face bore the weathered tan of someone who had spent half his life outdoors. His square jaw was covered in salt and pepper stubble, and his gray eyes carried both authority and fatigue, the eyes of a man who had seen too many betrayals in quiet towns that pretended to be peaceful. Tom's voice was low and steady as he approached, one hand resting on the holster at his side, not from threat but habit. "Mrs. Hughes? Miss Delgado? We received the call." His eyes swept the scene quickly, the chair lodged in roots, Anna's tear-streaked face, the dog standing guard, and Victor's rigid figure several steps away, fists still clenched as though he hadn't decided whether to fight or flee. Another officer, Deputy Riley, followed close behind. He was younger, in his early 30s, with sandy blonde hair, a neatly trimmed mustache, and the kind of earnestness that hadn't yet been worn down by years on the job. His posture was precise, his brown uniform pressed, and he carried a notebook he seemed eager to fill, a man determined to do things by procedure. "We need statements," Riley said, his voice brisk but not unkind. Mia stepped forward first, her small frame trembling but her tone firm. "I saw everything. He released the brakes. He pushed her. She would have gone over if not for the dog." She pointed at Victor, her brown eyes flashing with a mixture of fury and fear. Victor's face hardened, his dull hazel eyes narrowing into slits. He tried to summon calm, tried to pull the mask of respectability back over his features. "She's lying," he said, his voice cold, smooth like water over stone. "My wife panicked, that's all. The dog spooked the chair. It was an accident." Sheriff Tom stepped closer, his gray eyes drilling into Victor's. "An accident doesn't leave your wife crying for her life," he said flatly. Then, glancing at Mia, "And an accident doesn't come with a witness." Victor opened his mouth to argue, but Tom cut him short with a gesture. "We'll sort it at the station. Cuff him." Deputy Riley moved swiftly, his hands practiced as he drew the metal bracelets from his belt and snapped them around Victor's wrists. Victor stiffened, his lean body shaking with suppressed rage, his jaw clenching until the muscles bulged. He muttered curses under his breath, his voice low and venomous, but he did not resist. Anna wept harder as she watched, her lips trembling. "He tried to kill me," she whispered, her voice small but carrying in the wind. Rex whined softly, pressing his body closer to her, his eyes never leaving Victor as if he still didn't trust the man not to lunge again. Over the following days, the investigation moved quickly. Documents were recovered from Victor's office at home. Overdue loan notices, bank letters, threats from private collectors. A notebook was found, its pages scrawled with calculations and bitter phrases, lists of debts, and a chilling line written more than once. "She doesn't need to live for me to start over." Even more damning were the papers partially burned in the fireplace, drafts of legal documents, guardianship clauses, and evidence that he had sought to secure Anna's inheritance in his sole name. At the courthouse weeks later, the story came fully to light. The trial was held in the old stone building on Main Street, its steps worn by generations of feet, its oak-paneled courtroom heavy with solemn history. The gallery was packed, the townspeople of Black Ridge drawn like moths to the spectacle of a love story rotted into crime. They whispered among themselves, their faces pale, their voices hushed with disbelief that Victor, the quiet carpenter they thought reliable, could attempt such treachery. Anna sat at the front, her hands trembling as she adjusted the skirt of her altered gown, a choice she had made to remind everyone what was nearly lost. Her chestnut hair was neatly brushed, her skin pale but resolute, her gray-blue eyes swollen with tears but steady. She spoke with halting words, her voice cracking as she recounted the moment she had trusted her husband's hands on the chair, only to feel the world tilt into betrayal. We had been married 10 years, she whispered to the jury, and he told me to wear the dress again. I thought it meant we were starting over, but it was the moment he decided to end me. She broke down then, pressing a hand to her mouth, her shoulders shaking. Rex lay at her feet, his body curled but alert, his amber eyes flicking between her and the man in chains. The court allowed his presence after Anna's lawyer argued he was more than a pet. He was evidence, a living witness to what had happened. Victor sat at the defendant's table, shackled, his suit ill-fitting now, his lean frame seeming smaller under the weight of his downfall. His hazel eyes were empty, his face a mask of bitterness, his dark hair hanging in disarray. He did not speak except to sneer at the proceedings, his lips curling into wikihad disdain whenever Anna faltered or the dog shifted. The jury heard the evidence, Mia's testimony, the photographs recovered from her camera showing Anna's chair at the brink, the documents of debt and destroyed legal drafts. The verdict came swiftly, guilty of attempted murder. The judge, a tall woman in her early 60s with iron-gray hair swept into a bun and a voice like a hammer on steel, pronounced the sentence with clarity. Victor Hughes, you are hereby sentenced to 25 years in state prison with no possibility of parole for 15. The gavel fell, and the room erupted in murmurs. The townspeople shook their heads, their faces stunned at how a man they thought quiet and dependable had hidden such darkness. Some wept openly, others clutched their coats as though bracing against a storm that had entered their lives. But when their eyes turned toward Rex, lying calm and vigilant at Anna's side, their expressions softened into something reverent. Whispers rose. That dog saved her. That dog is a miracle. And in that small mountain town, where the wind carried secrets through the pines, the story of the German shepherd spread quickly, not as rumor but as gospel, a tale of loyalty so fierce it defeated betrayal. The hospital room was small, but filled with a quiet light, its walls painted in muted cream that softened the hard edges of medical machinery. The scent of antiseptic lingered faintly in the air, mingling with the sharper fragrance of winter drifting in from the cracked open window. Outside, snow fell in delicate spirals, the first flurries of the season, spinning like silver confetti over the pines of Black Ridge. The mountain town seemed hushed. The streets below the hospital softened under the slow gathering of white. Inside, Anna sat upright in her wheelchair, dressed not in hospital gowns, but in the very wedding dress she had worn that day on the cliff. The fabric was creased now, the hem stained by dirt and roots, but to her it glowed with a meaning beyond perfection. Her chestnut hair, brushed neatly, framed her pale face. Her gray-blue eyes were swollen from tears, yet shimmered with something brighter, something born of gratitude rather than grief. The sunlight through the window caught on her veil, and for the first time in days, she allowed herself a smile, thin but real. At her side, Rex lay curled, his strong body pressed against the wheels of her chair. His head rested on the satin folds of her gown, the contrast of golden black fur against white fabric striking as a painting. His amber eyes, soft now after the fury of the cliff, gazed up at her with boundless devotion. His ears flicked occasionally at sounds in the hallway, but his focus never wavered. He seemed almost to understand the sacredness of the moment, his great chest rising and falling in a rhythm that steadied Anna's own uneven breath. Nurses came and went quietly. One of them, Gwen, a petite woman in her 20s with short sandy hair and freckles scattered across her pale cheeks, paused at the door. She was known for her cheerful disposition, the kind who always found time to leave kind notes at patient bedsides. Today, her eyes softened as she looked at Rex and Anna, whispering, "What a guardian angel he is." Then she slipped away, leaving them in peace. Anna let her hand drift down, her fingers tangling in Rex's thick fur. Her voice broke softly, meant only for him. "I thought today would give me photographs to remember love by," she whispered, "but instead God sent me you to remind me what love truly is." Her tears fell again, sliding silently over her cheeks, but this time she did not wipe them away. They were tears of release, of understanding. In her heart, she felt no bitterness toward the lost decade, only sorrow at what Victor had chosen to become. But she also felt the quiet certainty that she had been spared, and that she was not alone. As the snow thickened outside, the door opened gently, and Emma Fields entered, a family friend from church. Emma was in her late 40s, tall and slender with silver threads in her long black hair tied back loosely. Her olive-toned skin bore lines carved not from age but from years of listening to other people's sorrows. She worked as a teacher in town, the kind who remembered birthdays and noticed when children wore the same shoes too long. She carried a bouquet of winter lilies, their pale petals trembling in the chill. Her voice was warm as she stepped closer. "I heard what happened, Anna. And I wanted you to know. You're not just alive. You've been given back to us, given back to the world for something more." Anna accepted the flowers, her fingers brushing the cool stems, and nodded through her tears. "I don't know why God saved me," she said, her voice fragile but clear. "But I believe he sent Rex. I believe he wanted me to see that love is not about vows spoken once, but about loyalty lived every day." Emma's eyes glistened as she bent to stroke Rex's head. The dog thumped his tail against the floor softly, acknowledging her kindness but never moving from his post at Anna's side. Emma stayed a while, speaking gently, reminding Anna that she would not walk this road alone. Then she left as quietly as she had come, her shawl trailing a faint scent of lavender behind her. Alone again with Rex, Anna looked out the window. The snowflakes caught the light of the late afternoon sun, each one unique, each one fleeting, and together they transformed the harshness of the world into something almost holy. Her heart swelled as she realized this day, her 10th anniversary, was no longer marked by betrayal, but by survival, by the miracle of a dog who refused to let her fall. She lowered her gaze back to Rex, whose amber eyes blinked slowly, tenderly, as if to tell her that his purpose was not finished, that he would remain. She smiled, a smile washed in tears, and spoke aloud the words that had been forming inside her since the cliff. "On my 10th anniversary, God did not give me a perfect photograph. He gave me a miracle." Rex's ears twitched, and he pressed his head deeper into the folds of her gown, sighing as though content to carry the weight of her gratitude forever. The snow outside thickened into a curtain of white, and to Anna it seemed like heaven's blessing, falling softly upon the earth. She closed her eyes for a moment, her hand resting firmly on Rex's head, and in the silence she felt a peace deeper than she had ever known. Love had not abandoned her. Love had simply come in another form, four-legged, fur-covered, eyes burning with loyalty, a gift she would treasure for all her days. Sometimes miracles do not arrive with thunder or lightning, but on quiet pause and faithful eyes. On her 10th anniversary, Anna discovered that love is not always found in vows spoken by men, but in loyalty lived by God's creatures. Through Rex, she was reminded that the Lord sends angels in many forms, some with wings, some with fur, to protect us when betrayal pushes us to the edge. In our daily lives, we too may face cliffs of fear, loneliness, or despair. Yet, if we hold to faith, God will never leave us without a miracle. He will send the help we need, often in ways we least expect. If this story touched your heart, Share it so others may feel hope, leave a comment with your thoughts, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories of love, faith, and redemption. May God bless you, and may His light guard you and your loved ones, two-legged and four-legged alike.